I only wanted to silence my husband's phone. One message changed everything I believed about my family. I wish I had never read those words, but I could never forget them. My name is Halona Thunderbird. I am a wildlife rehabilitator. I always believed my family would protect me until they became the people who hurt me the most. The device sat on the mahogany side table, vibrating with an insistent, rhythmic buzz that grated against the quiet of our living room. My husband, Mark, was out in the garden, and the screen flashed with a notification that seemed far too personal for a random telemarketer. I reached for it, intending only to flip it face down and reclaim the silence of our evening. My thumb brushed the screen, and the lock interface gave way to an open message thread. The contact name was my sister, Clara. The text was short, cold, and devastatingly clear. It wasn't a casual check-in. It was a confirmation of a secret account, a series of transactions, and a date I recognized instantly as the day my inheritance fund had been liquidated. My breath hitched, catching in my throat like a shard of glass. I read the words a second time, then a third, desperate for my brain to construct some harmless alternative meaning. There was none. My hands began to tremble so violently that I had to set the phone down on the rug to keep from dropping it. I stared at the device as if it were a venomous snake, the black screen reflecting a distorted version of my own shocked face. The silence in the house suddenly felt heavy, suffocating. I realized then that the people I trusted most, the two people who occupied the center of my world, were operating in a shadow I hadn't even known existed. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead, and forced myself to walk toward the kitchen. I had to act normal. I had to breathe. If they knew I had seen this, the game would be over before I could find out just how far this betrayal went. The next few days were a masterclass in performative normalcy. I watched Mark and Clara with a microscopic intensity that made my head ache. When we sat down for dinner at my father's house, I observed the way Clara tilted her head when she laughed, a gesture I used to find charming, but which now felt like a rehearsed maneuver. Mark squeezed my hand under the table, his touch lingering in a way that used to feel like affection but now felt like a cage. I kept my gaze steady, eating my meal while my mind raced through a catalogue of past events. I thought about the time last year when Mark insisted I take on an extra contract at the rescue center, claiming we needed the buffer for our mortgage. I thought about how Clara had suddenly found the money to renovate her kitchen the same month. I had defended them both when others suggested they were being distant. Now, their every smile looked brittle, their every laugh sounded hollow. I found myself replaying our conversations, searching for the flickers of deceit I had been too blinded by love to notice. I acted as if nothing had changed, nodding at their stories and offering polite, empty feedback. Internally, I was shivering. Every time Mark walked into the room, I felt a physical recoil, a quiet scream building behind my teeth. I realized that the house was not a home, it was a theater stage, and I was the only person who hadn't realized the play was a tragedy. I spent my nights in the guest room, claiming a migraine, but in reality, I was scouring the digital footprint they had inadvertently left behind. I couldn't access Mark's cloud account directly, but I had the password he used for our shared utility portal, and like so many people, he was tragically unoriginal with his security choices. I logged in, my heart hammering against my ribs. I found more than I bargained for. There were emails, dozens of them, exchanged between my sister and an offshore financial firm. They weren't just moving money, they were actively stripping my name from the family trust. The level of complexity required to pull this off suggested they had been planning this for at least a year. My sister, the woman who had helped me bottle feed orphan fox kits, had spent 12 months systematically dismantling my financial security. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a moment of weakness or a desperate gamble gone wrong. It was a calculated, cold-blooded erasure of me. I sat on the cold hardwood floor, the glow of the laptop casting long, jagged shadows against the wall. I promised myself I would not cry. Crying was an indulgence I couldn't afford. I took a deep breath, feeling the air chill my lungs, and locked the screen. The betrayal had a weight, a physical density that made the room feel smaller, tighter. I stood up and walked to the mirror, looking at the woman staring back. She was terrified, yes, but she was also beginning to harden. The web grew larger the more I pulled at the threads. I followed the financial trail to a series of shell companies registered in my father's name, though the signatures were clearly forged, clumsy, rushed efforts that assumed I was too ignorant of legal filings to ever check. I realized my sister had managed to manipulate the entire family dynamic, positioning herself as the gatekeeper of my father's declining health while isolating me with claims that I was too stressed or too busy with my animals to deal with administrative matters. It was brilliant, in a sick, twisted way. Mark hadn't just been a witness. He had been the architect. He provided the technical cover, the fake invoices, the quiet reassurance that everything was being handled by the experts. I stared at the bank statements, the numbers blurring into a nonsensical fog before snapping back into clarity. They hadn't just taken money, they had taken the future I had been building for the rescue center. I had planned to expand the facility next year, a dream that was now evaporating into the pockets of the people I shared my breakfast with every morning. The realization didn't make me scream. Instead, it brought a terrifying, icy calm. My life, as I had understood it, was a fabrication. I was living in a paper house, and the fire had already been set. I began to drop breadcrumbs, subtle little hints to see how they would react. I mentioned at dinner that I was planning to hire an independent auditor for the family trust, just to clean up some loose ends before the new fiscal year. The effect was immediate. Clara's fork clattered against her plate, and Mark's face went a shade paler, his hand twitching toward his phone under the table. They laughed it off, of course, a chorus of, "Why would you bother, that's so much paperwork," and, "Let us handle it, darling, you have enough to do." They dismissed my concerns as if I were a child playing with fire. For a moment, the gaslighting worked. I felt a surge of doubt, a flickering internal voice asking if maybe I was overreacting, maybe I had misinterpreted the digital documents. Then, I remembered the way my sister had looked at me when I mentioned the auditor, a flash of pure, unadulterated panic. I knew then that I wasn't crazy. I was just the only one who realized the floor was rotting beneath us. I became stronger, my resolve solidifying into a weapon. If they wanted to play a game of shadows, I would turn on the floodlights. I spent weeks hunting for the physical proof that would hold up in more than just my own mind. I found the old emails in a forgotten folder on the family computer, back when we used a shared account for vacations. They were dated 18 months prior, showing the initial discussions between Mark and Clara about how to steer the assets away from me while keeping my father in the dark. I connected the dots. Every time there was a surprise expense for the house, or a market downturn that affected my accounts, they were actually shifting capital. I understood why my father had been so tired lately, so detached. They had been feeding him misinformation, keeping him sedated with a curated version of reality. I stopped blaming myself for not noticing earlier. How could I have expected to see a knife coming from the people who were supposed to be holding my hands? I wasn't stupid. I was just honest, and I had assumed they were too. That was my only mistake. The final piece of the puzzle came from a recording device I had tucked into my handbag during a family lunch at the club. I had left the bag near the bar while I went to the restroom, and when I returned, they were still talking, thinking I was out of earshot. The audio was crisp. I heard my sister laughing, describing how easy it had been to make me look like I was struggling with my mental health so my father would sign over the power of attorney. I heard Mark agree, adding that once the final transfer was cleared next week, they would finally be free of the burden of caring for me. The betrayal felt less like a blow and more like an amputation. I walked to my car, my fingers numb against the steering wheel. I didn't cry. I sat in the silent parking lot, watching the sun dip below the horizon, and I listened to the recording 3 times until the words lost their sting and became nothing more than cold, hard evidence. I chose courage. I chose to survive. I sat at my kitchen table, my laptop open, surrounding myself with printed bank statements, notarized signatures, and the transcribed logs of every conversation I had recorded. I organized them into clear, chronological files. I called Sarah, a friend from my college years who worked as a civil attorney. She didn't offer pity, she offered strategy. We went over the plan for 3 hours, mapping out exactly how to present this so there would be no room for their usual deflection. I prepared for every excuse, the "it was for your own good" narrative, the "you're misinterpreting things" gaslight. I knew they would try to minimize, to blame stress, to play the victim. I didn't care about their performance. I cared about the record. I wanted the truth to sit on the table, undeniable and heavy, and I wanted to watch the air leave the room when they realized they had nowhere left to run. The final confrontation took place in the living room where this all started. I invited them over for what I described as a final review of the estate, pretending to be the naive, compliant sister and wife one last time. When they arrived, looking perfectly composed in their designer clothes, I simply locked the front door and laid the documents out on the coffee table. I didn't speak. I waited until they noticed the files. When they started their scripted lines, the "Halona, what is this?" and "Honey, we talked about this," I played the recording. The silence that followed was absolute. They tried to deny it, of course. Mark started talking about server glitches, and Clara began to sob, saying I had betrayed her trust by invading her privacy. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't call them names. I simply pointed to the bank records, the forged signatures, and the email timestamps. I watched the color drain from their faces. I watched the lies, one by one, collapse under the weight of the facts. They were not powerful architects anymore. They were just two scared, greedy people cornered by the truth. The fallout was immediate and brutal. My father, who had been sitting in the corner listening, suddenly stood up. His transformation was startling. He looked at Clara, not with the softness of a father, but with the cold, hard stare of a man who realized his legacy had been poisoned. He did not yell. He simply told her to leave his house and never return, effectively cutting her out of his life and his will in one sentence. He turned to Mark, his silence more terrifying than any shouting match, and simply motioned toward the door. I saw the look of total defeat in Mark's eyes as he realized he had lost the house, the money, and the reputation he had spent years trying to maintain. I didn't feel triumph. I felt a hollow, quiet clarity. I ended our marriage that night, not with a dramatic scene, but by handing him a paper that spelled out the end of every shared interest, every bank account, and every promise. I watched him walk out, a man who had traded his integrity for a bag of sand, and I felt the weight finally lift from my chest. I took the keys to the house and handed them to my father, who was now weeping in the armchair, broken by the revelation of his own children's greed. I walked out the front door, the cool night air hitting my skin like a baptism. I didn't look back at the house, or the life I had built inside it. I drove to the rescue center, the quiet chirping of the night birds greeting me. I stepped into the rehabilitation wing, where the animals were safe and the truth was simple. I sat on the floor with a young owl, feeling the soft feathers beneath my hands, knowing that for the first time in years, there was no one in my life I had to hide from, no one I had to track. I was finally, truly alone, and for the first time, it felt like freedom. I closed my eyes, listening to the steady, rhythmic breath of the world around me, feeling the tension evaporate from my neck and shoulders. The silence was no longer a threat, it was a sanctuary. I had reclaimed my life from the wreckage, piece by piece, and I knew that whatever came next would be mine alone. I walked over to the desk, picked up my planner, and crossed out the last of the obligations that held me to the past. Tomorrow, I would wake up in a new room, in a new town, with nothing but the quiet hum of the forest to keep me company. I stepped outside into the moonlight, the grass damp and cool beneath my feet, and started to walk toward my car. I was finished.